August 2nd, 216 BC. By the time the sun went down on that day, a brutally hot summer afternoon on the flat, dusty plains of southern Italy, 70,000 men were dead. 70,000. In a single afternoon. To put that number in context, the Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest single engagement in all of American history, killed approximately 8,000 men over 3 days of fighting. The first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916 killed 19,000 British soldiers in 24 hours. Those numbers still make us catch our breath more than a century later. Cannae killed 70,000 in 8 hours. The Roman army, the most powerful, most experienced, most disciplined military force the ancient world had ever produced, marched onto a field in the morning with 86,000 soldiers. By sunset, they were gone, not retreating, not scattered, not captured in the chaos of defeat. Gone. The fields of Apulia were carpeted with Roman dead for as far as a man could walk in any direction. Among those dead, 80 senators, nearly a third of the entire Roman Senate, killed in a single afternoon. 2 former consuls, the current serving consul himself, thousands of equestrians, the class of wealthy, educated Romans, who filled the officer ranks and the administrative heart of the Republic, a generation of Roman leadership, simply erased. In 8 hours, on a Tuesday morning in August, and the man who did it, a Carthaginian general who had spent the previous 2 years marching an army of 50,000 soldiers from Spain across the Alps in autumn, through avalanches and ambushes and blizzards that killed half his men before he ever set foot in Italy. That man was standing on a ridge above the slaughter when his cavalry commander rode up to him and said, "The road to Rome is open. Wide open. No army left to stop you. No garrison to speak of. The city in panic." And Hannibal Barca looked south toward Rome and turned away. No general in the history of warfare ever won a more complete, more devastating, more tactically perfect victory than Cannae. And no general ever, in that supreme moment of triumph, made a more controversial decision than the one Hannibal made on the evening of August 2nd, 216 BC. Why did he stop? That question has been argued and analyzed and debated by historians, military theorists, and generals for more than 2,000 years. Julius Caesar studied it. Napoleon studied it. The architects of World War I built their entire strategic blueprint around an attempt to replicate it. West Point teaches it. The Israeli Defense Forces study it. 2 millennia later, it is still the standard against which all other acts of tactical generalship are measured. By the end of this video, I am going to give you the most complete answer the historical record allows. Not a simple answer. There is no simple answer, but a true one. And to get there, we need to go back much further than August 2nd, 216 BC. Back to a city on the coast of North Africa. Back to a family. Back to a sacred fire, and a 9-year-old boy, and a promise that would change the course of Western civilization. To understand Cannae, you first have to understand what Rome had already done to Carthage. Because what happened on that plain in Apulia was not simply a tactical masterpiece. It was the culmination of a personal vendetta 30 years in the making, a hatred so deliberate, so carefully nursed across 2 generations of one family, that in the mind of Hannibal Barca, it had become almost indistinguishable from sacred obligation. Carthage, in the middle of the 3rd century BC, was one of the most extraordinary cities the ancient world had ever produced. Founded by Phoenician settlers on the northern coast of Africa, in what is today Tunisia, just 40 kilometers from the modern city of Tunis, it had grown over 5 centuries into the dominant commercial empire of the Western Mediterranean. Its circular harbor was an engineering marvel, a military inner harbor capable of sheltering 220 warships, surrounded by an outer commercial harbor where merchant vessels from 3 continents docked and unloaded. The city's population rivaled Rome's. Its trading networks reached from the Atlantic coast of Spain and Morocco to the Levant. Carthage controlled the silver mines of southern Spain, the grain fields of North Africa, and the sea lanes that connected the 2 halves of the ancient commercial world. Rome was something entirely different, a land power, a republic of farmers and soldiers that had spent 2 centuries grinding its way to dominance over the Italian peninsula through a combination of military excellence and political genius that was, in its own way, as remarkable as anything Carthage had built. Rome had unified Italy not by destroying its defeated enemies, but by incorporating them, by making them Roman allies with specific military obligations, giving them a stake in Roman success, building the most sophisticated alliance network the ancient world had yet seen. By 264 BC, Rome controlled most of Italy and was beginning to look outward. The 2 powers had coexisted for over a century under treaty arrangements that kept them out of each other's way. Rome was a land power. Carthage was a sea power. There was room for both. Then a local dispute in the Sicilian city of Messana gave both powers a reason to intervene, and the logic of great power competition did the rest. Neither intended a general war. Neither could back down once committed. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. 23 years of grinding, attritional combat across the island of Sicily and the waters between Sicily and Africa and the coasts of North Africa itself. Rome, a republic with essentially no naval tradition, built a fleet from scratch, modeled on a captured Carthaginian warship, adding a boarding bridge called the Corvus to compensate for Roman inexperience at sea. They lost 2 entire fleets to storms. They built new ones. They lost those too. They built more. The sheer institutional stubbornness of Rome in that conflict is one of the most extraordinary things in ancient history. By 241 BC, Carthage was exhausted, its treasury empty, its political will broken. It signed a peace agreement, ceding Sicily to Rome and agreeing to pay a substantial indemnity. Rome then made it worse, while Carthage was dealing with a catastrophic revolt by its own unpaid mercenary soldiers, a brutal 3-year war that nearly destroyed the city from within. Rome sent troops to seize Sardinia and Corsica. No declaration of war, no negotiation, no warning of any kind. Simply, we are taking these islands now. You will also pay us 1,200 additional talents of silver. If you refuse, we will declare war while you are already fighting for your survival. Carthage paid. It had no choice. The humiliation was absolute and deliberate. Rome had taken advantage of Carthage at its most vulnerable moment to strip away the last of its major island territories and demand payment on top of the insult. In the political culture of the ancient Mediterranean world, where reputation and honor were the foundations of power, this was not merely a military defeat. It was a public degradation, a signal broadcast to every power watching that Carthage could be kicked while it was down and would not strike back. No one felt this more keenly than Hannibal Barca. The Barca family name, in the Semitic language of Carthage, meant lightning. Hamilcar had commanded Carthaginian forces in Sicily during the final decade of the First Punic War and had never been defeated in the field. He had been ordered to make peace by politicians back home who had run out of ships and money, forced to sign a treaty he considered unnecessary, watching Rome take from his people what his army had never surrendered. The seizure of Sardinia and Corsica afterward was, in his view, an act of criminal opportunism that demanded a response. He channeled his anger into strategy. Now unable to fight Rome directly, Carthage had no army capable of it, no navy, no treasury to fund either. He went to Spain. Spain was the opportunity. Spain had silver mines that could rebuild Carthaginian power from the ground up. He spent the last decade of his life in the Iberian Peninsula, building an army from tribal levies and professional soldiers, building alliances with local peoples, building the financial and military infrastructure for a war he knew he would not live to fight himself. Before he left for Spain, he gathered his household. He was taking his oldest son with him. The boy was 9 years old and had begged to go, not merely as a passenger, but as a soldier. Hamilcar agreed, but on one condition. He led the boy to the altar. He stood him before the sacred fire of the gods. He made him place his hand on the sacrifice, and he made him swear an oath that he would never be a friend of Rome. That boy was Hannibal. He swore, and he meant it with an absoluteness that would have surprised even his father had Hamilcar survived to see what his oath produced. The promise wasn't simply anti-Roman political sentiment, the kind that most Carthaginian aristocrats carried quietly. It was something more total, a structuring principle around which Hannibal organized his entire existence for the next 40 years. Hamilcar died in Spain in 228 BC, fighting in battle against a tribal coalition. His son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair took command, expanded Carthaginian territory significantly, founded the city of Cartagena on the southeastern Spanish coast, and was then assassinated by a Celtiberian slave in 221 BC. Whereupon the army, the professional, a battle-hardened Carthaginian Spanish force that Hamilcar had built and that had been shaped by 15 years of near-continuous campaigning, voted on its next commander. They voted for Hannibal. He was 26 years old. He had grown up in that army. He had learned war from his father and his brother-in-law since he was old enough to hold a weapon. He had fought in cavalry engagements, sieges, and pitched battles across southern Spain. He was beloved by his soldiers in a way that transcended normal military loyalty. He ate what they ate, slept where they slept, was invariably the first into danger and last to withdraw from it. He spoke reportedly 6 languages and could address Greek mercenaries, Numidian cavalry, Spanish tribal warriors, Libyan infantry, and Gallic swordsmen, each in their own tongue. He was, by every ancient account, one of those rare human beings whose physical presence changed the mood of a room or an army. He was also, underneath the warmth and the soldier's easy confidence, possessed of a strategic intelligence of such unusual depth and patience that it would take Rome nearly 20 years and the near destruction of its republic to fully comprehend what it was dealing with. Within 2 years of taking command, he had made his decision. He was going to invade Italy. Not from Africa across the sea, where Rome's rebuilt navy would intercept his transports. Not through the narrow coastal corridor, where a single Roman army could block him at a pass. He was going to march from Spain, across southern France, across the Rhone River, and then, before the autumn weather closed the high routes, he was going to take his army over the Alps. Over the Alps, in autumn, with war elephants. His senior officers, men who had spent their careers in the brutal practical world of ancient warfare, thought he had lost his reason. The Alps in autumn meant ice, avalanche, frostbite, hostile mountain tribes, and terrain that made supply and movement nearly impossible. Armies didn't cross the Alps. That was why the Alps had always been Rome's northern shield. His officers were wrong. In the late summer of 218 BC, Hannibal set out from Cartagena with approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. He crossed the Pyrenees, fighting the entire way against Spanish tribes who wanted no foreign army in their territory. He crossed the Rhone River, 400 meters wide and running fast with late summer snowmelt, using improvised rafts, not pacified elephants on reed platforms, and a flanking cavalry force that drove off the Gallic warriors waiting on the far bank. He left his brother Hasdrubal in Spain with enough force to hold Carthaginian territory and marched northeast toward the mountains. By the time he reached the Alpine foothills, attrition from combat, disease, and desertion had reduced his force to perhaps 50 or 60,000. He had not yet reached the mountains. What happened in the Alps is almost beyond the capacity of written description to convey adequately. The passes were narrow ledges, hacked from sheer rock faces, with drops of hundreds of feet onto glaciers below. The weather in October in the high passes was already murderous. Snowstorms, wind cold enough to freeze the moisture in a man's lungs, thaw that turned every step on the narrow paths into a potential death. Men who had been born in the heat of North Africa and Spain and had never seen snow found themselves lying down on the path simply because they could no longer make their legs move forward. The local mountain tribes, the Allobroges and Catarages, were waiting for them. They knew these passes. They knew where the route narrowed to single file, where the cliffs provided cover for rolling boulders, where a cavalry force couldn't deploy to defend the column. They attacked from above, from both sides simultaneously, from ambush in the dark. Horses screamed and fell. Elephants, animals that had never encountered cold like this, whose feet were not built for ice, stumbled and slid off the path and disappeared. The sound of men falling, horses falling, tons of equipment and baggage and supplies disappearing into the gorges below was continuous. At one critical point, a massive rockfall had completely blocked the route. The alternative path went over a cliff. Hannibal had his engineers build enormous bonfires directly against the rock face and heat the stone until it glowed, then pour vinegar over it. The thermal shock cracked the granite along its natural fault lines. His men worked through the night with picks. By morning, there was a passage, 15 days from the first snowfield to the Italian foothills. He arrived in the Po Valley with 26,000 men. He had started with somewhere between 50 and 60,000. He had lost more than half his army in the mountains and hadn't fought a major battle yet. By any conventional military calculation, the campaign should have been over. The expedition should have been abandoned. Any other general in the ancient world, having lost half his force to terrain and weather, would have found a way to winter in place and counted a strategic victory merely to have survived the crossing. Hannibal looked at 26,000 men and began planning how to use them. Rome received the news that a Carthaginian army was in northern Italy and was not, initially, particularly alarmed. 26,000 men, weakened from the crossing, far from supply, deep in enemy territory. Rome could put a consular army of 40,000 in the field within weeks. They had done it before. They would find Hannibal, engage him, and end this. Rome had never faced Hannibal in battle. That was, as it turned out, on the single most important piece of information in the entire conflict, and Rome didn't know yet what it meant. The first lesson came at the Trebia River in December of 218 BC, and it came with the particular cruelty of something that should have been entirely avoidable. Rome sent the consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus with an army to deal with Hannibal in the north. Sempronius wasn't an incompetent man. He was, however, a politically motivated man whose consulship was ending and who wanted a victory, a clear, decisive victory, before his term expired. He was eager for battle. He believed, as most Romans genuinely believed at that point, that Roman discipline and Roman numbers were ultimately irresistible. Hannibal understood this about him immediately. He had studied Roman commanders the way a physician studies a disease, looking for the characteristic responses, the predictable patterns, the impulses that would be reliably triggered under specific conditions. On the night before the battle, Hannibal had his troops rub their bodies with olive oil against the cold of the December morning. He fed them a full hot meal before dawn. He had fires built throughout the camp and kept burning through the night. His men woke warm, fed, and ready. Then he sent his Numidian light cavalry across the Trebaia River in the pre-dawn darkness to ride up to the Roman camp and make a nuisance of themselves, throw javelins, wheel away, come back, shout insults, make it impossible to ignore. Sempronius, furious, ordered his army to pursue. The Roman soldiers crossed the Trebaia River in December, chest-deep in water cold enough to cause muscle failure, without breakfast, and without preparation, in the gray pre-dawn. By the time they formed their battle line on the far bank, they were wet, hypothermic, and ravenous. Their weapons were stiff from the cold. Their hands were numb. Hannibal's infantry held the center in a conventional line. His heavy cavalry swept the Roman horsemen off both flanks before the infantry engagement was fully underway. Then Mago, Hannibal's youngest brother, 20 years old, who had been concealed since before dawn in a bend of the river vegetation with 2,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, struck the Roman rear. Front, both flanks, and rear, simultaneously, to an army that could barely feel its sword hands. Of the 40,000 Romans and Italian allies who crossed the Trebaia that morning, approximately 10,000 survived, the most of them by being strong enough swimmers to break through the encirclement and get back across the river. The rest were dead or captured before the afternoon. Rome was shocked. But shock and defeat had happened before. New levies were raised. A new commander would be appointed for the next campaign season. One overconfident consul. It would not happen again. It happened again. Worse. Spring, 217 BC. The new consul Gaius Flaminius marched his army south into Etruria in pursuit of Hannibal. Flaminius was a different personality than Sempronius, more politically radical, more personally aggressive, a man who had risen through Roman politics as a champion of the common people against the aristocratic Senate. He had contempt for cautious senatorial generalship. Now he was certain that energy and aggression would carry the day where timidity had failed. Hannibal observed him, understood him, and chose his trap site accordingly. The northern shore of Lake Trasimene, in central Etruria, was a perfect natural killing ground. A narrow strip of land between the lake on the south and a range of steep, wooded hills on the north. The path ran for several miles through this defile before emerging onto open ground. Hannibal positioned his heavy infantry at the far western end to block forward escape. He placed his Spanish and Gallic troops in the hills overlooking the defile's northern flank. He stationed his cavalry and light infantry at the eastern entrance, behind where the Roman column would enter. Then he waited. Flaminius led his army into the defile the next morning. There was dense fog off the lake, the kind of rolling, impenetrable white fog that forms in early morning over still water and fills every low-lying space. The Romans could see perhaps 20 meters in any direction. The column stretched for miles behind the general at the head, tens of thousands of men and horses and supply carts moving single file along the narrow path between the invisible water on their right and the invisible hills on their left. When roughly 15,000 Romans had entered the trap, Hannibal gave the signal. All three forces attacked simultaneously. The cavalry sealed the entrance from behind, cutting off the rear of the column. The infantry erupted from the tree line on the hillside above, charging down through the fog into the flank of the column. The blocking infantry ahead prevented any forward escape. In the fog, with no room to form a battle line, with men and horses colliding in blind panic, with enemies coming from above and behind and in front simultaneously. The Roman column simply ceased to exist as a fighting unit. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter in a fog, conducted with the methodical efficiency of men who had rehearsed exactly this. Consul Flaminius died in the first charge, killed by a Gallic cavalryman who recognized his armor and rode him down. 15,000 Romans died in 45 minutes. The remaining 10,000, who had been at the tail of the column and had not yet entered the defile, were surrounded the next morning by Hannibal's cavalry and surrendered without a fight. There was nothing else to do. 2 battles, 2 catastrophes, approximately 50,000 Roman soldiers dead or captured, both times by an army smaller than their own. Both times through the same underlying mechanism. Read the Roman commander's psychology. Design a situation that exploits the predictable Roman tactical response and execute it with a precision that the Romans, whose entire military doctrine was built on the assumption that their system was unbeatable, had no framework for countering. Now Rome panicked. The Senate, in emergency session, voted to appoint a dictator for the first time in over a century. They chose Quintus Fabius Maximus, a senior statesman of exceptional strategic intelligence, a man who had studied Hannibal carefully enough to arrive at a conclusion that was strategically brilliant and politically toxic in equal measure. He would not fight Hannibal. Hannibal was a genius in open battle. Therefore, Fabius would deny him open battle. He would shadow the Carthaginian army from the high ground, cutting off foraging parties, intercepting supply lines, refusing to engage in the pitched confrontations that Hannibal needed to achieve his strategic objectives. He would not try to win the war. He would wait for the war to win itself, for Hannibal's army to erode through attrition, disease, and the difficulty of supplying 50,000 men indefinitely in enemy territory without a fixed base of operations. The Roman people hated it. They watched Hannibal march through Italy, burning farms, sacking towns, taking what he wanted from the Italian countryside, while their dictator sat on the hills above and observed. They gave Fabius a name, Cunctator, the delayer. They said it with contempt, saw political pressure built throughout the campaign season. Fabius's own second-in-command fought an unsanctioned engagement against part of Hannibal's force, achieved an ambiguous result that Rome celebrated as a great victory, and was voted by the assembly an equal share of the dictator's power. The strategy had been politically neutered before it had time to work. When Fabius's term ended in late 217 BC, Rome held elections for the next year's consuls. The voters' mandate was clear: no more caution, no more watching. Find Hannibal, fight him, destroy him. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, experienced, careful, deeply skeptical of fighting Hannibal on open ground, was elected on the strength of his military record and aristocratic credibility. Gaius Terentius Varro, a new man from a merchant family, who had campaigned on a platform of aggressive action and absolute confidence in Roman numbers, was elected on the strength of popular sentiment. Together, they raised the largest army Rome had ever put in the field. 8 legions, 86,000 soldiers, the flower of Roman manhood. They would fight in the summer of 216 BC. They would fight at Cannae. In the last week of July, the Roman army arrived at Cannae. The site had strategic logic. It was near a grain depot that Rome needed to secure, and its position on the Aufidus River provided water. But Paulus saw the terrain immediately and was alarmed. The Apulian plain near Cannae was flat, dry, and wide open. There were no natural features to anchor a flank, no hills to constrain movement, no forests to limit cavalry. It was exactly the kind of ground that made large-scale cavalry operations possible, and Hannibal had the best cavalry force in the ancient world. Paulus argued for moving, for finding a site with better terrain, somewhere that would neutralize the Carthaginian cavalry advantage. He was overruled by Varro, by the political pressure to act, by the hunger of his army for the grain depot that Hannibal's forces had already captured and were using themselves. They would fight here. They would fight soon. Hannibal received the news of the Roman approach with something that resembled satisfaction. He had spent 2 years maneuvering into exactly this kind of confrontation, an open ground battle against a larger Roman force on terrain that maximized his cavalry. This was the engagement he had designed his entire Italian campaign around, when on the night of August 1st, both armies camped within sight of each other on the Apulian plain. From the hills above, their campfires formed 2 vast constellations of light on the dark ground, separated by the black ribbon of the Aufidus River. In the Roman camp, the mood was difficult to name. Not simple fear. Roman soldiers were trained to manage fear, and most of them had done it before. Something more specific than fear. 2 battles that had no precedent in Roman military experience. A general that every officer in the army had heard described, at this point, in terms that did not quite fit the familiar categories of enemy commander. Trebia, Trasimene. Names that had acquired a weight they hadn't had before. Consul Paulus walked his camp that night. He was a 50-year-old aristocrat who had been at war in some capacity for most of his adult life, and he walked his camp with the particular attention of a man who wants to remember everything about it clearly. He stopped at fires and spoke to his men, not the grand pre-battle oratory that Roman commanders were supposed to deliver, but quiet, direct conversation. He checked dispositions with his officers. He went over the battle plan again, looking for weaknesses, looking for the alternative he had been trying to find for weeks. He found none he hadn't already raised and been overruled on. Across the river, the mood in the Carthaginian camp was reportedly very different. The ancient sources describe laughter. Hannibal's officers had seen Trebia and Trasimene. They had watched their general read Roman commanders like texts in a language only he could fully understand. They had confidence that shaded into something quieter and more certain than ordinary pre-battle nerve. One of Hannibal's senior officers, a man named Gisco, looked out at the vast Roman camp and went to his general with something approaching genuine anxiety. "The number of the enemy is very great," he said. Hannibal looked at him with an expression the ancient sources describe as amused. "There is one thing you have not noticed, Gisco," he said. "In all that great number, there is not one man named Gisco." The officers who heard it laughed, and in that laughter is one of the most revealing small windows into Hannibal's character that the ancient record preserves. A man who could hold his own tension so far beneath the surface that on the night before the most consequential battle of his life, with 86,000 Roman soldiers camped within a mile of him, he was making jokes. Behind the jokes, the plan was fully formed. Hannibal had looked at this ground, at this army, at the Roman tactical system in all its strengths and all its rigid predictabilities, and he had designed something that had never been attempted in the history of ancient warfare. Not a battle line, a machine designed to destroy the Roman army using the Roman army's own greatest quality, its aggressive, mass-forward, weight-of-numbers tactical doctrine, as the mechanism of its own annihilation. The morning of August 2nd was brutally hot. The sirocco, the dry wind that comes off the North African desert, crosses the Mediterranean and hits southern Italy, carrying fine dust and a heat that feels almost personal in its intensity, was blowing directly from the southeast, directly into the faces of the Roman soldiers as they formed their battle lines. This was not accidental. Hannibal had chosen his side of the field deliberately, placing his army with the wind and morning sun at their backs. The Romans formed up, looking into the glare, squinting against the dust. These details matter. They tell you something about the quality of Hannibal's attention, the way his mind operated at every level simultaneously. He was not only designing a revolutionary tactical formation, he was accounting for wind direction, sun angle, heat, dust, and the accumulated psychological effect of minor discomforts on soldiers who were already tense and had been waiting for this moment for months. Varro commanded that day. It was his turn in the consular alternation. He deployed the army along what were, for Rome, recognizable and rational lines. But he made one significant modification to standard Roman doctrine that would, in retrospect, be the fatal adjustment. He deepened the infantry formation. Standard Roman deployment spread its heavy infantry, the legionaries, in 3 relatively shallow lines, giving individual soldiers room to use their weapons and maneuver effectively. Varro concentrated his formation, making it narrower and deeper. More men per unit of frontage. The logic was the logic of the battering ram. Concentrate the mass. Apply it to the enemy center. Drive through. With 70,000 infantry against Hannibal's 30,000-foot soldiers in the center, the weight of numbers should be simply irresistible. On the flanks, the cavalry took their positions. The Roman citizen cavalry under Paulus on the right wing, where the Aufidus River constrained the flank. The Italian allied cavalry on the open left. Hannibal's deployment was immediately noted by Roman observers as unusual. His center, the Spanish and Gallic infantry, brave fighters but not his best troops, was pushed forward in a convex bulge aimed directly at the Roman lines. The shape was like a crescent, with the points facing back. On either side of this bulging center, slightly set back and positioned to form the inner flanks of the formation, stood his African veterans, the Libyan infantry who had marched with him from Africa or crossed the Alps, fought at Trebia and Trasimene. These men were armed, notably, with captured Roman equipment, Roman swords, Roman helmets, Roman shields taken from the dead of the previous 2 battles. They looked, at a distance, almost like Roman soldiers. On the far left wing, opposite the Italian allied cavalry, Hannibal placed his Carthaginian heavy cavalry under the General Hasdrubal, not his brother, a different commander, one of the finest cavalry officers of his generation. On the far right, opposite the Roman citizen cavalry hemmed in by the river, went the Numidians. Hannibal himself positioned with the center, standing among the Spanish and Gallic infantry, who would bear the worst of the Roman assault in the battle's first phase. He was there because these men needed to see him there. His officers understood the center deployment was going to be brutal. The Gauls and Spaniards would face the full weight of a 70,000-man Roman push, outnumbered perhaps 5-1 in the killing zone. Hannibal knew exactly how it looked. That was the point. The battle opened not in the center, but on the wings. On the Carthaginian left, Hasdrubal led his heavy cavalry directly at the Italian allied horsemen. The allied cavalry was competent. These were experienced soldiers, well-mounted, fighting on familiar Italian ground. But they were outnumbered, and they were facing cavalry that had fought together across Spain, through the Alpine crossing, through 2 major victories in Italy. Cavalry that had been shaped by years of Hannibal's training into a force of extraordinary combined discipline and aggression. So the melee on the left flank was violent and brief. Within minutes, the Allied cavalry broke and fled. Stragglers were cut down in the first few hundred meters of pursuit. Then, Hasdrubal made the decision that separated Hannibal's tactical system from everything that came before it. He stopped pursuing. In ancient warfare, this was almost unheard of. When cavalry routed the enemy horsemen, you pursued. You chased the fleeing enemy, cut them down, celebrated your wing's victory, and eventually returned to find the main battle decided. Pursuit was the natural, almost irresistible impulse after a successful cavalry charge. It was what cavalry was for. Every Roman commander watching from the center would have expected the Carthaginian cavalry to disappear into the distance after the routing allied horse. Hasdrubal wheeled his cavalry away from the pursuit. He turned 90 degrees and began riding across the rear of the battlefield. On the opposite flank, the Numidians were doing something that looked, from a distance, like inconclusive skirmishing. They were trading charges with the Roman citizen cavalry, withdrawing, coming back, never committing to a decisive engagement. The Roman cavalry was frustrated, unable to break the Numidians, unable to disengage, simply held in place, occupied, waiting for Hasdrubal. In the center, 70,000 Roman and allied infantry marched into the Carthaginian bulge. The Spanish and Gallic infantry met them head-on. The fighting was close and catastrophically loud, the particular kind of ancient battle noise that no modern description quite captures. The continuous crash of bronze on bone, on shields slamming shields, the short stabbing strokes of Roman gladi working in the press, men screaming in Latin and Spanish and Gaulish and Punic all simultaneously, the ground underfoot turning slick within minutes. The Carthaginian center bent. It bent further. Step by step, the convex bulge flattened, then began to reverse, the crescent curving inward as the Roman mass pushed forward. To the Roman soldiers in the press, this looked exactly like what it had always looked like before, the enemy giving ground, breaking. The Roman instinct, the instinct that had been drilled into these men since their first year of military service, was to push when the enemy gave way. Push harder. Press the advantage. They pushed harder. The Spanish and Gallic infantry were extraordinary in this phase of the battle. They gave ground with absolute deliberate control, not routing, not panicking, not breaking and running, which would have ended the trap before it closed. Stepping back, fighting the entire time, absorbing the pressure, bleeding, dying in significant numbers, maintaining their formation under conditions that would have shattered most ancient armies. These men knew what they were doing. They had been told the plan. They understood that the worse things looked for them, the better things were going overall. What the Roman soldiers in the center could not see, what was physically impossible to see from inside a packed mass of 70,000 men, was what was happening to their formation as a whole. As they pushed deeper into the retreating Carthaginian center, their own front expanded, and their flanks thinned. The deepened formation was spreading as it advanced. The men at the outer edges of the Roman mass were no longer facing purely forward. They were beginning to angle sideways, their flanks exposed, the dense columns behind them pressing them forward, while the enemy ahead continued to give way. The convex bulge had become fully concave. The Romans were inside a bowl. Hannibal gave the signal to his African veterans on the wings. They pivoted inward, both wings simultaneously, moving like two enormous hands closing around something held between them. The African infantry on the right wing turned left and struck the exposed left flank of the Roman mass. The Africans on the left wing turned right and struck the exposed right flank. Both movements at the same moment. Both made by rested, disciplined, veteran troops, to men who had been standing relatively still while the Gauls and Spaniards in the center had been fighting and dying for 2 hours, hitting an enemy that was fully engaged forward, already compressed, already committed to the push. The outermost Roman soldiers suddenly had enemies coming from the side. They tried to turn and fight, but the men directly behind them were still pushing forward into the retreating center, unaware of what was happening on the flanks. The Roman formation began to compact further. The outer ranks were being squeezed between the African infantry attacking from the sides and the momentum of their own army pushing from behind. Men found themselves unable to swing their swords in a full arc, unable to step back to make room, unable to do anything except push forward into the press. Then the sound came from behind. Hasdrubal's Carthaginian heavy cavalry, which had destroyed the Allied cavalry on the far flank and made the long ride across the entire rear of the battlefield, hit the back of the Roman formation. On the remaining open flank, the Numidians, who had been holding the Roman citizen cavalry in controlled stalemate for 2 hours, now overwhelmed them. The last avenue of escape was closed. 86,000 Romans, completely surrounded, on all 4 sides, Carthaginian infantry and cavalry, closing inward. What followed was not a battle. Battles have maneuver, decision, the possibility of escape or reversal. What happened at Cannae after the encirclement closed was something else, something for which the ancient sources use the word slaughter with careful, precise intention. The Romans could not retreat. The Carthaginian cavalry sealed the perimeter. They could not maneuver. In the compressed killing ground, men were packed so tightly that in some sections of the formation, soldiers who were killed could not fall, their bodies held upright by the press of living men around them, being carried forward by the momentum of the mass. Polybius, the Greek historian who researched Cannae within living memory of the battle, who interviewed survivors and had access to sources that no longer exist, recorded that men were found dead with their faces buried in the earth. They had scooped out holes with their own hands. They had suffocated themselves rather than wait for the sword. Others had their hamstrings cut by Numidian cavalry riding along the outer edge of the mass, disabled, unable to walk, to left, to lie in the dust and the heat until the infantry reached them. The killing went on for approximately 8 hours. 70,000 Romans died. Among them, 80 senators, including the Princeps Senatus, the most senior member of the Senate, the most prestigious individual in the Roman Republic, and 2 former consuls, and 29 of the 48 military tribunes for that year. The equestrian class that formed Rome's officer corps and commercial backbone was decimated. Entire noble families lost their last male representatives on that plain. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the man who had argued against fighting at Cannae, who had warned about the terrain, who had been overruled at every step, was struck by a sling stone early in the battle and unhorsed. He continued to fight on foot. When the encirclement closed, a Roman knight named Gnaeus Lentulus found him sitting on a stone in the killing ground, too wounded to stand, still in his armor, watching his army die around him. Lentulus offered Paulus his horse. He could still escape. The battle was lost, but he could survive it. Paulus refused. He told Lentulus to ride to Rome, to tell the Senate what had happened here, to urge them to strengthen the walls before Hannibal came. Then he sent Lentulus away. He died at Cannae with the men he had commanded. Hannibal's losses: 5,700 dead, 70,000 Romans, less than 6,000 Carthaginians. Sit with that ratio for a moment. The Battle of Cannae is 2,200 years later, still the most tactically complete destruction of a numerically superior force by a smaller one in all of recorded human history. Not ancient history. All of history. Military academies on 6 continents teach it. The German Schlieffen Plan, the strategic document that set the opening moves of World War I, was an explicit attempt to recreate Cannae on the scale of an entire European theater of war. General Norman Schwarzkopf's left hook in Operation Desert Storm in 1991 was a conscious Cannae-inspired double envelopment. The United States Army War College requires its study, 2,200 years. Still the standard. Hannibal was 40 years old when he stood on the ridge above the dust and the dying. The sirocco carried the smell of the battlefield north across the plain. The sun was beginning its descent toward the blood-orange horizon that would turn the dust into fire. Below him, the plain of Apulia was no longer recognizable as a battlefield. It was a carpet of Roman dead, and the road to Rome was open. Hannibal was the finest cavalry commander in the Carthaginian army. He had just directed the execution of the most perfectly designed flanking operation in the history of Mediterranean warfare. He was flushed with the particular intensity of a man who has just watched something impossible become real, and he was absolutely certain about what came next. He rode to Hannibal on the ridge and said the words the ancient sources have preserved across 2,000 years. "Come. Let us follow at once with the cavalry. Let me tell Rome that I have taken them before they even know we are coming." Hannibal told him he needed time to consider. Hannibal stared at him, and then he said, the other sentence that history has carried forward unchanged. "Hannibal, you know how to win a victory. No, you do not know how to use one." Hannibal did not march on Rome. He moved his army south and east into Campania and the Allied territories that were now, after the news of Cannae spread across Italy, defecting from Rome in significant numbers. Capua, the second city of Italy, opened its gates to him. Dozens of smaller communities followed. Much of southern Italy switched sides within weeks of the battle. The strategy of alliance breaking that Hannibal had designed the entire campaign around appeared, in those first weeks after Cannae, to be working. But he did not march on Rome, and the question that Hannibal's reproach first articulated has been argued ever since by everyone who has studied ancient warfare. The first and most commonly offered explanation is the siege equipment problem. Hannibal had no siege train. He had marched over the Alps with cavalry and infantry and elephants, but not with the heavy battering rams, siege towers, and catapults required for a sustained assault on a major fortified city. Roman cities had walls. Walls, without siege equipment, were formidable obstacles even for an army fresh from the greatest victory in ancient history. This argument has real merit and real weight. Taking Rome, even a Rome in panic, even a Rome with no defending army, without siege equipment, would have been genuinely difficult. The walls were solid. The city was large. A prolonged siege without siege engines against a city with access to internal food stores and water could fail. But this argument has always felt incomplete to historians who have studied it carefully. Cannae left Rome not merely militarily defeated, but psychologically shattered. Ancient sources describe senators openly debating abandoning the city, loading the treasury onto ships, and retreating to the colonies. The streets were reportedly full of women crying and citizens in visible terror. There was no garrison of any significance behind those walls. The city was defended by its walls, and its walls alone. An army of 50,000 experienced soldiers, fresh from the greatest victory in the history of Mediterranean warfare, might well have broken through on momentum, terror, and the sheer psychological impossibility of resistance, even without proper siege equipment. The supply argument is more persuasive. Hannibal had been in Italy for 2 years, operating entirely on captured supplies, foraged grain, and the goodwill of defecting allies. He had no fixed base of operations, no supply line from Carthage, no certainty of resupply. Every day his army remained in Italy was a calculated gamble. A march on Rome would have extended that gamble to its maximum point, besieging the most powerful city in the Mediterranean world, at the end of a supply chain that didn't exist, with no reinforcements coming. And reinforcements were the crux of the problem in a way that went beyond Hannibal's individual decisions. Carthage itself was failing him. Hannibal's strategic conception was sophisticated and, in outline, entirely rational. He did not believe he could destroy Rome through military means alone. Rome was too large, too deeply rooted, its alliance system too extensive. His actual strategic objective was not to burn the city of Rome, but to break Rome's empire of Italian allies, to demonstrate so comprehensively that Rome could not protect its partners, that those partners would rationally conclude their self-interest lay in switching sides. Without its Italian allies providing the manpower for its legions, Rome would be isolated, financially strangled, and eventually compelled to negotiate a peace that restored what the First Punic War had taken from Carthage. Cannae had delivered the first phase of this strategy perfectly. Allied cities were defecting, the alliance system was cracking, but the strategy required that Carthage support the campaign with reinforcements and supplies sufficient to maintain the army in Italy and exploit the political openings Cannae had created. This Carthage refused to do. The Carthaginian political establishment was divided by factional politics. The Barca family had enemies at home, and those enemies used every opportunity to divert resources away from Hannibal's Italian campaign. Reinforcements were sent to Spain instead, where a Roman counter-campaign under the Scipio brothers was threatening Carthaginian silver revenues. The men and material that Hannibal needed to consolidate Cannae's gains never arrived. He sent letter after letter to Carthage. He sent his brother Mago, who had hidden in the river reeds at Trebia, and now brought a sack of golden rings to Carthage, rings stripped from the hands of dead Roman knights, as a measure of the victory's scale. Mago asked for 200 troops, 20 elephants, and 1,000 talents of silver. Carthage sent him to Spain. There is one more explanation that the ancient sources gesture at, but that modern historians have perhaps been reluctant to state plainly because it is harder to quantify than logistics and politics. Rome did not behave the way Hannibal's strategic model predicted. His strategy depended on Roman allies defecting, yes, but it also depended, at a deeper level, on Rome responding to catastrophic defeat the way that defeated powers in the ancient world normally responded, by negotiating, by seeking terms, by accepting that the military situation had fundamentally changed and that accommodation was more rational than continuation. Rome refused. Within 72 hours of learning that 70,000 of its citizens were dead, the Senate passed emergency legislation to raise new legions, banned public mourning after a period of 30 days, or forbade any mention of peace negotiations, and decreed that Rome would fight on. Fabius Maximus was restored to effective authority. The strategy of harassment and attrition was reinstated. No more pitched battles. Shadow Hannibal. Cut his supply lines. Deny him the decisive political capitulation that his campaign required. The thing that Hannibal had perhaps not fully internalized, the thing that his extraordinary tactical genius had never quite accounted for in its models of human behavior, was that Rome wasn't like the kingdoms and city-states he had studied. Rome wasn't a monarchy where killing the king ended the war. It was a republic, a system, a culture that had been forged over 5 centuries of existential struggle with enemies, both external and internal. It had survived the Gauls sacking the city in 390 BC and rebuilt. It had survived plague, famine, civil conflict, and the grinding attrition of the First Punic War. It had a political culture that treated catastrophic defeat not as a reason to sue for peace, but as a reason to try harder. 70,000 dead men was to Rome devastating. It was not, to Rome, decisive. Hannibal may have sensed this. Some historians argue that his refusal to march on Rome immediately after Cannae reflected not a failure of nerve or a logistical miscalculation, but a genuine understanding that Rome would not fall to a direct assault in the way that other cities had fallen. That the correct strategy was what he had already designed, the slow destruction of the alliance system, political rather than purely military, and that marching on Rome would sacrifice that strategy for a dramatic gesture that might not deliver what it promised. If so, the strategy failed. Not because it was wrong in concept, but because Carthage refused to provide the resources to sustain it. He spent 15 more years in Italy, winning battles, winning allies, never able to force the political crisis that Cannae had seemed to promise. Watching Rome, following Fabius's strategy, slowly rebuild. Watching allied cities that had defected after Cannae drift back toward Rome when it became clear that Carthage was not coming with the armies that Hannibal needed. Fighting brilliantly and strategically without effect, like a man hammering on a door with perfect technique, while the people inside quietly brick up the windows. In 203 BC, Rome sent an army to North Africa. The threat to Carthage itself, to the city, to everything, finally forced Hannibal to leave Italy. He had never lost a major engagement on Italian soil. He left Italy undefeated and crossed back to Africa, abandoning the country he had marched into as a conqueror 16 years earlier. He would fight one more great battle. At Zama in 202 BC, he met Publius Cornelius Scipio, the Roman general who had studied Hannibal more carefully than any other, who had absorbed the lessons of every Carthaginian victory and built his own tactical system in deliberate response to them. Scipio neutralized the Carthaginian cavalry advantage by making alliance with the Numidian king Massinissa, who switched sides and brought his cavalry to Rome. He broke the war elephant charge by opening gaps in his own lines and letting the animals through harmlessly. And then, using a modified version of Hannibal's own double envelopment, he encircled the Carthaginian center. Hannibal lost. For the first time in his life, commanding an open battle, he lost. He reportedly said afterward, when asked to rank the greatest generals in history, that he placed Alexander first, Pyrrhus second, and himself third. When asked why not first, given what he had accomplished, he said, if he had beaten Rome, he would have placed himself first. He had not beaten Rome, therefore, not first. Hannibal Barca lived for another 20 years after Zama. He served as an elected magistrate in Carthage, working to reform its finances and pay off the enormous war indemnity Rome had imposed. When Rome demanded his extradition, afraid even in defeat that he was planning another war, which he probably was, he fled east, living first at the Seleucid court in Syria, then in Bithynia on the Black Sea coast, always one step ahead of Roman diplomatic pressure, always advising local kings against Rome, always one more exile away from the oath he had sworn at 9 years old. In 183 BC, surrounded by Roman agents who had finally cornered him, he swallowed poison he had kept in a ring for exactly this moment. He was 64 years old. He had fought Rome in some form or another for nearly 4 decades. He had never stopped. His last recorded words, which may be apocryphal, but which ring with the particular resonance of things that ought to have been said, even if they weren't. Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they find it tedious to wait for the death of a gray-haired old man. Rome did not send anyone to collect his body. In 146 BC, for 37 years after Hannibal's death, Rome razed the city of Carthage to the ground, killed or enslaved its entire population, salted the earth, according to some accounts, though modern historians debate whether the salt was literal or metaphorical. Carthage ceased to exist. Its language, its literature, its religion, its art, almost everything it created, was destroyed. We know Carthage almost entirely through Roman sources, which is a little like knowing the life of a man solely from the account of the person who killed him. Hannibal's legacy survived the destruction of everything he fought for. The Battle of Cannae entered the permanent vocabulary of military thought immediately after it was fought, and has never left. Julius Caesar studied it and modeled his own cavalry tactics partly on its lessons, for Napoleon cited it as one of the formative influences on his understanding of warfare. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategic blueprint for the opening of World War I, the document that set the entire Western Front in motion in August 1914, was explicitly framed as an attempt to achieve on the scale of a European theater what Hannibal had achieved at Cannae on the scale of a single field. Double envelopment. Destroy the enemy army through encirclement rather than attrition. Cannae at the scale of nations. It killed 17 million people when it was tried. Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the left hook that swept through western Iraq and encircled the Iraqi Republican Guard, was designed with conscious reference to Cannae. The officer who led the main armored thrust cited it explicitly in his after-action analysis. 2,200 years. The battle that was fought in 8 hours on a dusty plain in southern Italy, by armies using bronze swords and leather shields, is still shaping the way that armies think about how to destroy each other. But here is what I keep returning to, after going through all of it. 70,000 men died in 8 hours, because one general understood something about human nature that transcended the specific military technology of his era. He understood how crowds behave under pressure, that mass human action, once committed in a direction, is almost impossible to reverse, even when the direction is catastrophic. He understood the psychology of victory, that an army that has always won will interpret the first signs of an ambush as signs of the enemy breaking, and will push harder into the trap that is closing around it. He understood the psychology of institutional confidence, that Rome's absolute faith in its own system was the vulnerability that the system itself could not see. He designed a machine that used all of those things against the people who embodied them. And then, at the moment of his greatest triumph, with the road to Rome open and his cavalry commander begging him to take it, he stopped. Whether that was wisdom or the single great miscalculation of his life, history has never fully agreed. Hannibal said he didn't know how to use a victory. Rome's survival seemed, in the end, to prove the point. But Hannibal never seemed to doubt his choice. He had come to Italy to break Rome's empire. Cannae had cracked it. The strategy was not wrong. The war was lost for reasons that went beyond any decision he made on that ridge on August 2nd. Lost in the councils of Carthage, lost to the factionalism that denied him reinforcements, lost to the particular Roman quality that the Romans called virtus, and that we might translate, inadequately, as the refusal to accept that defeat means you have lost. You can argue about Hannibal's decision forever. People have. The argument will never be fully resolved, because the counterfactual, what would have happened if he had marched on Rome, is precisely the kind of question that history cannot answer. Only imagine. What cannot be argued is this. On August 2nd, 216 BC, on a dusty plain in the heel of Italy, a general commanding 50,000 men faced an army of 86,000 and annihilated them. Completely. Methodically. At a cost to himself of less than 6,000 soldiers. Using a tactical conception so elegant and so far ahead of its time that every military mind of consequence for the next 2,000 years has studied it and come away changed. It has never been equaled. After 2,000 years of trying, it probably never will be. Rome received the news of Cannae and did something no one expected. They didn't surrender. They didn't negotiate. Within 72 hours, The Senate had banned peace talks and ordered new legions raised. How a republic that had just lost 70,000 men in an afternoon came back to dominate the Mediterranean for 600 more years. That is the story of Scipio Africanus, the one Roman general Hannibal respected. That video is already in production. Subscribe. You will be the first to know when it is ready.